Whoever had carved the door revealed in the anatomy of suffering. It stood as a 2-story tall slab of copper, positioned directly against the cavern wall, its surface adorned with an intricate bas-relief that disturbed the eye, a chaotic, clawing mass of human bodies sprawling upwards in a mound of flesh. Many of the figures cast horrified glances over their shoulders, fleeing from something unseen, something lurking just out of frame. Thousands of them, starved and wretched, with gaunt faces and sunken eyes, jutting ribs and distended bellies. Whispers circulated that they moved, but only when you weren't looking. Less than a week after its discovery, they brought it down with explosives. At that point, none of them truly understood what they had found, though a few, particularly those with religious inclinations, had their suspicions. The door was utterly wrong. It simply shouldn't have existed. Natural caverns didn't descend that deep in Britain, certainly not 1,000 meters. As scientists, they should have felt excitement, but they all agreed the door was repulsive. Staring at it too long induced an overwhelming urge to flee, akin to an ancestral memory, perhaps the same instinct that drives humans to avoid things that crawl and slither, things that rot and buzz and reek of death and decay. They had never been told how or why it was discovered, nor why the project was classified, only that they had to uncover what lay on the other side. When the charges finally detonated, they erupted like giant firecrackers, a sequence of deafening booms that reverberated throughout the entire cavern. He blinked dust out of his eyes as massive machines lowered the door, now free from its fittings, to the ground. Looking back, some details emerged more clearly than others. The air that wafted out was hot and dry, and he wasn't surprised. It felt intuitively correct, whether he admitted it to himself or not. The fact was, since the moment he laid eyes on the door, he had envisioned it as a gateway to hell, with a mental image that was oddly medieval. He had expected heavy stones, something reminiscent of an ancient castle rattling chains, the wails of the damned, the stench of sulfur, even little red devils with horns and pointy tails. But he hadn't anticipated shelves and books. That was the first tangible thing they encountered. Shelves lining the walls, hewn directly from the same rock as the cavern, rising far above their lights so that when they looked up, they were met with only darkness and dust. Endless rows of shelving extending into obscurity. Every inch was covered in books. There were no gaps, just dust and tattered spines of various sizes. Leather, fabric, paperback, faded pastels, and gold leaf letters in both familiar and strange alphabets. And it wasn't just the walls. The floor was strewn with random head-high piles of books, stacked as if some weary librarian had grown exasperated with finding room for them. They formed a labyrinth within the space, obscuring corners and doors, and the forward team, himself included, proceeded cautiously along the stone passageway, listening and scanning for signs that would make sense of the surroundings. There must have been thousands of books, and that was just in the first hallway they explored. Whenever they took one out, they found paper so thin it was nearly translucent, often inked with strange shapes and letters they couldn't comprehend. Otherwise, it was mere gibberish, not that they lingered on them for long. On that first day, whenever he took a book, he returned it quickly, always feeling an unsettling sensation that he was doing something wrong, something inappropriate. He disliked the void left behind on the shelves, a gap like a missing tooth, the darkness swirling within like deep waters. Safety in that place felt like an illusion, and touching the books seemed to risk shattering it. He couldn't articulate it precisely, except to say that he didn't want to do anything that might draw attention to himself. It was as if they were conspicuous, though only their own breaths, footfalls, and the shuffle of their movements could be heard. They could even hear each other's heartbeat, the discordant thump of several chests beating like a broken drum. Every now and then, there was a steady increase in the rhythm as they turned a blind corner, lifted a book just to glimpse its contents, or gazed up at the shadows above them. Each of them experienced false starts, as there was always an expectation that something would reveal itself soon, any moment now squeezed between two books or dangling overhead. It took more than 6 hours before that corridor opened up, and when it did, they were left dumbfounded. They emerged into a vast and terrifying mezzanine made of ancient rock, overlooking a chasm with no visible bottom, just floor after floor filled with shelves, filled with millions, billions. All along those distant walls and stories were little openings that led to more corridors like the one they had just emerged from, so many that it felt like staring at a rough shot. To look up, down, or anywhere in this beehive was to confront more books than anyone could read in an entire lifetime. They took their first break on that mezzanine. While radios didn't have much range in that place, they had the foresight to bring enough wire for a direct connection, and while using that, they contacted the main research site to update them on the situation. They were to continue for another 6 hours and then turn around. No more was the plan. Even that felt like too long. He wanted to leave. He wanted to confirm that somewhere there was a doorway that would lead back to reality. Ever since he'd entered that place, it felt as if he had stepped into a nightmare, a realm where reality was plastic. He told himself it was simply the scale of it all, the weirdness, but it was more than that. The very air down there felt thin. There were 6 of them, 3 scientists and 3 soldiers. The soldiers reacted to the situation with silence and an alertness that bordered on paranoia, constantly scanning the dark with rifle-mounted lights, flicking the beam from one high shelf to another, fidgeting, exchanging dark looks. In a way, he was thankful for their vigilance, but it kept him on edge, and he couldn't relax at all. During the first half of their little break, it seemed natural for the scientists to start talking. This was partly to fill the silence, but also partly to convince themselves they were excited about the implications of this find. Whatever those might be, rewriting history, archaeology on a new level, that sort of thing. It didn't take long before they persuaded themselves to take a closer look at those books. He would admit it didn't come easily, but they did a commendable job of convincing themselves they weren't truly afraid. They began slowly taking one book down, opening it, and then quickly replacing it. But then, with a burst of false bravery, they took more and more down, until each of them sat cross-legged with several books stacked up on either side, waiting to be read. He remembered at some point growing tired and looking up from his own pile, noticing Dr. Ashley muttering quietly as she traced some words with her fingers. "What have you found?" he asked. "It's the Latin alphabet," she replied, the first one he actually recognized the letters for. German. Perhaps none of them were linguists, so they were simply doing their best. But upon hearing B mention German, one of the soldiers came over and looked at the open page. "Germanic, but not German," he said. "You speak it?" He nodded. "My father is German, and I don't know what that is, but it isn't German." "Is any of it familiar?" Bayer asked while handing the book to him. After a brief nod from his co-lieutenant, Michel, he took it and began flicking through the pages. "I think this is the word for death, a sort of rough misspelling. Maybe this one is, I guess it's a bit like wanting, desire, I don't know. Not all the words seem to be in the right context either, so there are a variety of languages and alphabets. But as of yet, nothing we can make sense of." "What about you? Any luck?" Bayer asked him, and he looked down at the book currently open in his hands. "Some kind of Cyrillic, perhaps?" He shrugged. "I'm no linguist. We definitely need Dr. Rohr Sellers on the next expedition. I'm sure he could offer some insight. What about you, Dr. Rosenstein?" The third doctor in their group, a small, bald man, had been sitting quietly the entire time, frowning at one of the numerous books that lay open before him. The others assumed he was simply curious like Bayer, but there was an unsettling tension in the air that hinted otherwise. "Hey, Grant, have you found anything?" one of them ventured. His silence was disconcerting. He wasn't merely captivated. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and the veins along his temples stood out prominently. He had gone pale, his eyes wide and his lips cracked and dry. The soldiers, sensing the same strange energy, stood a little straighter. "Dr. Rosenstein?" one of them asked nervously. "Doctor, can you hear us?" The nearest soldier reached out and placed a hand on Grant's shoulder. The little man looked up, as if he had only just realized their presence. At first, they thought he might be relieved, his expression breaking into a thumbs-up grin. But soon it became evident that something was amiss. "Oh," he said with an anxious laugh. "Oh, right, of course." His eyes darted between them. "Of course, sorry, I didn't mean to alarm you." "Right," one of them said. "We were just discussing the books. Bayer thinks there might be a kind of German or Germanic language." Grant nodded, as if this notion was perfectly reasonable. "Yes, I imagine so," he replied, glancing around at the towering shelves. "Lots of languages, I'd say." Then, without missing a beat, he added, "They are sins." Silence enveloped the group as they tried to process his words. Meanwhile, Grant stood up and stretched, as if the act were the most natural thing in the world. "What are you on about?" one of them finally asked, sensing his reluctance to elaborate. "It's fairly obvious where we are," he said, leaning forward and scrutinizing them. "Darkly, these books are a record of all our sins, one for each of us. There will be books in German, both contemporary and historic, like the one you found, Dr. Ashling. But there will also be books in Russian, French, Arabic, and Chinese, not just contemporary tongues. Ancient Egyptian, Phoenician, Babylonian, Aramaic, Latin, and of course, lost languages that we never found, but that existed nonetheless. All of them, all the transgressions of the world are right here, recorded in the sinner's original tongue." By now, the soldiers had stepped a little closer, sharing worried glances with Bayer. Grant appeared to be on the verge of a breakdown, speaking frantically and anxiously, convinced of his own meaning yet failing to articulate anything coherent. "Grant, I think we need to go back. The real fun part is that I think you'll find books in languages that don't exist yet," he blurted out. "This isn't just a record of past sins, but all of them, every last one, even the ones we haven't committed yet. Grant, I'm going to have one of the men go back with you, if that's okay. I think you might need—" "These are mine," he said, gesturing to a book in his hand. "All of them," he laughed, a wild sound. "Not just the things I did, petty transgressions, all recorded with names and places, even little diagrams. There are even sins I only ever thought of, things I wanted to do," he added, giggling hysterically. "Sins I've yet to commit." He flipped through the pages randomly, laughing maniacally at something only he could see. "Though there aren't many," he cackled as he turned to the final page, tears welling in his eyes. "Just one, actually the last one. The last sin I'll ever commit." "Grant," one of them said. "I think." Before anyone could react, he dropped the book and took a running leap over the nearest edge. "This is the way we came, right?" Bayer asked, standing at the threshold of a corridor, a light tracking a wire that snaked into the darkness. "That's the cable we carried in here with us," one of the soldiers noted. But the young man glanced over at his co-lieutenant, Michael, who held a compass and looked less than pleased. "It's not the direction we came from," the older man stated. "We came south, so we need to head north." He pointed toward a second corridor embedded in the rock wall. "This has to be the way," Bayer insisted. "I trust this cable a hell of a lot more than I do a compass. Anything could be interfering with that thing. Besides, we know the cable leads to HQ because it's working. We spoke to them just a few minutes ago through this wire. It has to lead out of here." "That makes sense," one of them added, "but I marked the way we left with a piece of chalk, and that mark is over here." They pointed to a third doorway. "Damn," Michael muttered. "Regardless, I vote wire." Bayer nodded. "I trust it the most. It's a physical connection." "I guess I vote wire too," Michael chimed in. "Me too, but what do we do if we're wrong?" one of them asked. "What does that even mean? Did something move the wire or the door?" They fell silent for a few moments, contemplating the implications of their situation. When no one offered a response, one of them eventually hoisted up their backpack. "I suppose we don't have much of a choice either way," they said. "Do you really think there's a book in here for everyone?" Bayer asked, breaking the silence. It was the first time any of them had spoken in hours. So far, they had all been walking, fixated on the gloom ahead and behind them, watching carefully for signs that their fevered imaginations were correct in suspecting something lurking in the dark. "Grant seemed to think so," one replied. Then what are the odds he picked out his own book? I mean, if he's right that there are, 100 billion books or so? More, another replied. If he's right about the library containing future sins as well as the past, the odds are pretty slim. Then what are you thinking? She asked. If he did find it here, I don't think it was a coincidence, she interjected. Ahead, one of the soldiers suddenly stopped, raising his fist as he muttered something to the others, who knelt and aimed their rifles into the dark. What is it? One of them asked. You don't hear it? Michael called back. They all paused, straining to catch any meaningful sound amid the white noise of blood rushing through their ears and the thumping of their own hearts. Sure enough, there it was, a gentle rustling. Without a word, they moved quietly along the corridor until they reached the source of the strange noise. A door that hadn't been there on their way in, left ever so slightly ajar. Rifle raised, one of the soldiers used the barrel to nudge the door open a little further. "Oh, damn," he exclaimed, his voice echoing down the hall. The sound startled everyone, and Michael quickly pulled him back, ready to admonish him, when they all caught sight of what awaited on the other side, another corridor. But this one was lined not with books, but with severed heads, desiccated, pale, and gaunt. Row after row, they sat neatly next to one another, evenly spaced, their skin a paper white in the harsh glare of their lights, all of them sporting cloudy eyes. And they were speaking soft, eerie whispers issuing from wet lips, with no breath, no lungs, only the motion of rubbery jaws forming syllables and consonants lost in a rustling cacophony. The sound was horrific, a blend of wet and dry that crawled under his skin, igniting an inexplicable urge to lash out at the heads. But curiosity eclipsed his disgust, and he stepped closer, wincing briefly as one of the heads fixed him with its cloudy gaze. Yet he didn't stop. He leaned in to see every detail of its flaking skin, its vacant eyes glaring at him with a strange intensity. For his own sanity, he reached out to pick it up, noting with revulsion how the stump of its neck left a mottled brown fluid on the shelf behind. He just wanted to know if it was fake, but its skin was cold, and its brow furrowed in anger at his touch. The moment it was lifted into the air, every other head ceased their muttering and fixed him with foul expressions, prompting him to quickly put it back down, relieved when the murmuring resumed. Still, its eyes remained locked on him. "What the hell?" he whispered. "What is this?" Michael asked, scanning the upper shelves with his torch. The shelves stretched on and on, as far as the eye could see. What the actual hell is this? Slowly, a bizarre thought formed in his mind. "Blink if you can understand me," he said, kneeling down to look at the head he had just picked up. Instantly, everyone in the group stopped what they were doing and turned to witness the outcome of his little experiment. "Blink." Okay, he repeated, trying to steady his nerves. "Right once for no, twice for yes. Do you understand? Blink. Blink." "Right, okay." He glanced at the others for suggestions when B piped up. "Are these books a list of all our sins? Blink. Blink." "One book for one person?" she asked, eliciting a scathing look from the severed head. "Yes or no questions," he instructed her. One of the soldiers, the youngest, the one who had helped translate the German, stepped forward and asked, "Is this hell?" "Blink. Blink. Is this your punishment?" he added. "Blink. If this isn't the punishment," he said, "then what is?" All the heads fell silent, their muttering replaced by the strangest noise. Their faces twisted upwards, warping into grotesque parodies of joy, while their mouths moved in a rhythmic motion. When he realized what they were doing, a chilling dread crept down his spine. They were laughing at them. There was no door. The wire slipped through a tiny hole at the base of a wall that blocked off the corridor. The group stood in stunned silence for several minutes until Lieutenant Michael finally shook off the shock and issued an order. "Davis, get HQ on the line." One of the soldiers knelt and began to remove the communication set from his backpack. Within moments it was set up, and he spoke into the headset. "HQ, can you read me? Over." "I can read you," came the voice. "Well, I guess the wire still leads to HQ," he said. "Try checking the wall for seams," Michael instructed. "See if it moves hidden hinges or something. I don't know." Then, turning back to the soldier with the headset, he he said. "Tell them we've encountered an obstacle and need another team to get us out. Oh, and tell them to bring explosives. If this thing opens," he said, running his hand along the edges. "I can't see how it could. It's pretty solid. Unlike every other wall we've seen so far, this one is made of red bricks. But that doesn't mean it's somehow mobile. It seems as sturdy as any brick wall I've ever encountered." "Well, it came from somewhere," B said, trying to peer through the hole the wire disappeared into. "Damn it, I can't see anything." "HQ," the soldier said, "we're gonna need some assistance. There's an obstacle over." "Roger that. What's the obstacle?" "A wall," he replied. "Tell the next team to bring explosives." "Over a wall? Just send the team ASAP," the soldier urged. "Our way out is blocked. Over." "Well, I can confirm we are en route to your position. Just one question," HQ replied. "What's that?" the young man asked. "Why do you keep saying over?" Suddenly, the voice shifted, beginning to titter and giggle, at first quietly, then louder and louder, like a mean kid laughing at a prank. The cruelty in the high-pitched tone made his skin crawl, and he was about to snatch the handset and demand answers when a strange sound echoed a heavy grinding, like stone turning against stone. Before he could even ask what it was, B fell backward from her crouched position, quickly leaping to her feet and running off into the dark like a maniac. The effect on the group was chilling, and he stared back at the wall, desperately trying to comprehend what he had just witnessed. "Williams, go get her!" Michael barked at one of the soldiers before turning to him and shouting, "What the hell is our problem?" I don't know," he stammered. "Christ!" Michael hissed, snatching the handset from the confused young soldier. "Listen," he growled into it, "I don't know who you really are, but you need to get someone in charge right now." The sound returned loud and heavy, the grinding of massive rocks being shifted, and tiny stones began raining down in a cloud of dust. Something above had disturbed them, and they all stood in silence as the stones plinked off their helmets. "Is it just me?" Michael asked while looking toward the wall. "Or is it somehow closer?" "Hard to say," he replied. "I don't." Suddenly, the wall lurched forward, a terrifying movement that startled them all and made him trip over his own feet. Terrified, he scrambled backward as fast as he could while the handset continued to emit that malicious laughter. "I think we need to go," he said, trying to sound calm. The wall moved again, and this time it did not stop. The young soldier with the handset failed to react quickly enough. It advanced so swiftly that it engulfed him within seconds, knocking him to the floor with a heavy thump, and then rolled over him as if he were inconsequential. If you're anything like him as a child, you might have wondered what happened to someone caught in an escalator at the very top. The light was so dim that he still didn't fully understand what had occurred, only that there was a lot of blood. While it was quick, it was not quick enough. When the wall was halfway up the soldier's spine, he could still see the pain registering in his eyes. That was the last impression he had before Michael grabbed him by the collar and practically threw him back. They ran the way they had come, one foot after another. Time felt as if it stretched indefinitely, influenced only by pain and tedium. There were moments when, as he struggled to force one foot in front of the other, he wondered if he had actually been running for days instead of just hours. There was no real way to mark the passage of time, only monotony. Books flashed by in a blur. The floor was a featureless expanse of stone, and the rhythmic sound of his feet lost all meaning. Behind them, the wall advanced ever closer, accompanied by the horrific sound of grinding rocks, promising pain and nothing else. The only thing he could focus on was the exhaustion, which became a form of self-torture. Countless times he contemplated giving up. To this day, he still has nightmares where he is chased down that corridor. It wasn't a sprint, but it was fast enough, and there were no other routes except forward. That was the essence of the torment. Behind him was death, moving at a brisk jog, and ahead lay only darkness, punctuated by the erratic flicker of a torch. Throughout what he would later realize was a grueling 2-hour ordeal, the only thought in his mind was, when am I going to lose this fight? When will I collapse or give up? Imagine his relief when he heard a familiar voice cry out ahead, "What is your problem, lady?" When he spotted them, the young man was holding Bee by her shoulders while she struggled to drag him through an open door. That was when he recalled the little corridor filled with severed heads, not exactly the salvation he had hoped for, but it would have to suffice. Michael and he grabbed both of them and hurled themselves through the opening. Seconds later, far too close for comfort, the entire corridor they had been traversing plunged into pitch blackness. The wall overtook their positions, leaving them panting and exhausted on the floor, where thousands of severed heads regarded them with annoyance. When they looked back, they saw only pulsating flesh, a wall of it, hot and sticky, threaded with sickly blue veins. He didn't know what the wall was, but something about the meat behind the stone reminded him of hungry carrion. "It's a trap," Michael hissed as he examined the grotesque mass. "I don't know how, but we were led down the wrong path. It swapped the cables or something. I don't know, but we were lowered down there like rats." "Where's Davis?" the other soldier asked. "He's gone," Michael replied, gesturing toward the wall of meat behind them. "Whatever the hell that thing is, it got him. It looked like a wall, but it could move, and it just steamrolled him. Thanks for the warning, by the way." He growled at Bee, but she showed no sign of understanding. Instead, she sat on the floor, trembling, clearly in a state of shock. "Where now, sir?" the remaining soldier inquired, and Michael grimaced. "Where do you think?" he replied, pointing forward, the only direction that's available. The heads made for strange companions. They followed the group with their eyes, but did not cease their incessant muttering. It was grating, to say the least, a noise one might be able to ignore for an hour, but soon the papery rustle of their ancient lips became the only thing he could focus on, regardless of how hard he tried to push it from his mind. At least navigation was simple. Forward, the only way to go. They walked for about 6 hours before taking their first break. The corridor was wide, but they kept their distance from the heads and slept in a row, head to feet, while 2 of them stayed on watch, 6 hours each. He chose to stay up along with Michael, while Bee and the other soldier attempted to rest. Bee had barely emerged from her shock during the journey, speaking only a little toward the very end. She told them in a fragmented way what she had seen while kneeling by the wall. "Teeth," she said, and a face. Although she wouldn't or couldn't elaborate on those statements, he sensed she had witnessed something that had come perilously close to driving her completely insane. Even as it was, he doubted she would fully recover. She looked almost like a different woman, baggy-eyed with thinning hair. Perhaps it was simply the conditions down here. Michael didn't look too great either, and he had to assume he looked pretty rough himself, especially after that run. It had exhausted him, broken him not just from the physical exertion, but from the nightmare of it all. The reason he elected to stay on watch first was that he didn't want to sleep. A part of him feared he would only dream about being back in that hallway, running from the moving wall. He didn't want to revisit that place ever again, not even in a dream. There were moments when he came so close to giving up. He had never truly experienced despair like that before, not the kind where your knees buckle and your neck turns to rubber as your head bows. It must be what people stranded at sea feel when they lose the strength to keep treading water. So instead, he stayed up, trying to ignore the muttering of the heads. He even attempted to engage Michael in conversation, but he didn't have much to say. Losing Davis back in the corridor clearly troubled him. Hell, it troubled him, and he hadn't even known the guy. But he swore to this day he could still see the look on Davis's face as rock met flesh, and his legs and hips just vanished. In the end, he had only these kinds of thoughts for company and an abundance of time, so it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that he eventually fell asleep. It wasn't for 10 minutes at most, but it was enough time for him to wake up and see something dragging the sleeping soldier's body into the darkness of the nearby shelf, his head lolling unnaturally to one side. The movement was gentle, quiet, yet clumsy, like a child stealthily pulling a rag doll out of a toy box. He looked over to Michael and saw that he had also fallen asleep. So he nudged him with his foot, and Michael woke up with a lazy start. Only when he looked at him, confused for a few brief seconds, did he slowly register the terror on his face, realizing what was happening. He wasn't sure what he expected Michael to do, really, but he was the leader and well-armed, and he didn't want to be the one who had to figure out what to do next. Perhaps a part of him was tempted to just sneak off, to leave the young man to his fate, maybe even be if it just meant he could survive a little longer. In truth, he was relieved when Michael sprang into action immediately. He didn't want to be a coward. Michael leapt up and grabbed the young man's foot, and he rushed over to grasp the other leg. Together, they struggled to pull him back. He didn't mention it to Michael, but the way the soldier's body felt when he grabbed it, the muscles were too relaxed, too heavy. He couldn't explain it, but if anyone ever found themselves in the unfortunate situation of moving a corpse, they might understand what he meant. A living body supports itself. A dead one is just meat and water, and somehow feels so much heavier for it. He was dead. Still, they fought on. At some point, B must have woken up, realizing what was happening, and joined in. He remembered her trying to reach into the shelf to grab hold of the dead man's arm when she suddenly flew backward, landing with a heavy thud against the shelf behind her, knocking a few of the severed heads off their little stumps. Whatever lurked in the dark was clearly frustrated. It wanted its next meal and wasn't going to let them stop it. Slowly, a long inhuman arm reached out and grasped the body's groin. Its strange fingers split at the knuckle 1, 2, 3 times, a terrifying sight, especially given how each one moved independently. A dinner plate-sized monster of a hand was attached to a lean, muscular forearm devoid of hair. The moment he saw the hand reach out in his general direction, he let go of the leg and fell backward. Michael continued to struggle for a while, even drawing his pistol and firing a few shots into the dark. But in doing so, he only managed to cling to his comrade's corpse with one hand, losing his grip almost effortlessly. The body vanished into the shadows, and they were suddenly down to 3. "What the hell? What the hell? What the hell?" he screamed. He wanted to say something, perhaps a comforting word or an apology for dozing off, but then again, Michael had fallen asleep too. He didn't know what he was meant to do. Shock settled deep within him when B's quiet but oddly insistent voice broke through. "It isn't over." That hand re-emerged carefully, deliberately, placing itself on the floor, revealing more of the pale flesh that powered it. Then came another hand, and another, until its head slowly emerged from the darkness, fixing him with eyes that were black, bulbous, and far too numerous to be called human. Its mouth, a grotesque mass of dirty fingers, gray and bluish, with long rancid nails, looked like hundreds of squirming mandibles of a hungry spider. Michael opened fire, but it was as if he were shooting at hay, with no effect at all. The bullet struck with a wet whap, but no damage was done. The creature knocked him aside with pure contempt, pulling the rest of itself into the corridor, where it became clear that it had no legs. Instead, it relied on several long arms to suspend itself between the walls like a spider. One of those arms reached out and grabbed B. By the time she started screaming, it was already too late. Blood trickled from her ears, and there was a sound like a branch snapping. Her entire body went limp, and the monster dropped her to the ground, glaring at him with a grotesque, misshapen face and accusatory eyes. The lieutenant screamed as he fired again, but that thing seized him as if he were nothing but a doll, lifting him and squeezing so tightly that he dropped everything he held, his gun and flashlight, clattering to the ground. "Help me!" he screamed, reaching out for him. "Jeez, shoot the thing!" He ran forward, crouching down in hopes of avoiding the many arms. Already, Michael was being squeezed so tightly that blood spurted from his mouth, and the monster seemed to delight in his torment. He reached down, picking up the gun from the floor, just as Michael let out another desperate cry for help. But for some reason, his hand hesitated mere inches away. He faltered. Michael's blood dripped down, and he could hear the crunching of his ribs. In that most shameful moment, He grabbed the flashlight and ran. Michael's cries following him, screams, screeches, whimpers of breaking bones and tearing paper, sounds of torture and torment that felt like they lasted forever. He emerged from the corridor alone, stumbling on his failing legs, realizing that the monster had given up the pursuit. A few seconds later, he recognized he was back on the mezzanine, terrified and exhausted, contemplating whether it was worth trying to escape if it meant spending another second alive in that place. He fell to the floor and began to sob. Maybe it was time to take a dive off that ledge, just like Granddad. "What on earth are you doing here?" He whipped around to see an old man in robes staring at him like an impolite intruder. Without meaning to, he began to laugh. His sanity was clearly on its final legs. The old man said, leaning aside to get a look down the long corridor behind. "Now, why did you go down there?" He wanted to answer, but couldn't quite bring himself to do anything except laugh and gasp for air. "I think you really ought to go home," the old man admonished like a teacher scolding a child. "This place is hell," he cried, rocking back and forth on his knees. "Yes," the old man nodded. "Good for you. This is a small part of hell, one that overlaps slightly with Earth, if I remember correctly. I'm assuming that's how you got down here. What happened to your friends anyway?" he added. He looked back the way he came and pointed. "Oh," the old man sighed. "You know I left your books out specifically so you'd find them and figure it out. I know that bold fellow worked it out, so once you knew this place was hell, why did you waste another second sticking around?" He shrugged, unsure what to say in response. "We got waylaid," he gasped. "Misled." "Fair enough," the old man replied. "I probably should have done more to ensure you got home safely. That's partly my fault, although I won't apologize. You, Ed, this place, didn't you see the door? What part of that was inviting? You have to take some of the blame." He wanted to mount a defense, but found he didn't have one. When it became clear that all he could do was sob and mutter, the old man's body language softened, and he reached out a hand. "Come on, I'll take you back." "What about the demons?" he asked. The old man frowned. "Those weren't demons," he snapped. "This place is defunct. Mortal souls are meant to demonstrate repentance by wandering the near-eternal halls in search of their book. Only when they find it are they allowed to move on. The whole thing didn't quite work out. 86 quadrillion books take a tad too long for the average person to find theirs, so this entire wing was abandoned, and now only sinners are left behind." "That thing was never human," he cried, pointing at the corridor he had emerged from. "Nobody's soul looks human," the old man said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Least of all the kind of person who gets sent to hell. This isn't a place for people who eat meat on Friday or cover their neighbor's oxen. It's for the cruel and the malicious, cowards and opportunists. A lot of people in this place have souls that have more in common with anglerfish and trapdoor spiders than with their fellow man. And it's not a condition that improves after several thousand years either. The soul changes, twists, and so do their physical forms." "And what about you?" he asked, reaching up to take the old man's hand. "Why do you look so normal?" "Oh," the old man said as he helped him up, "that's because I built this place." The last thing he could remember, as the old man grabbed him by the shoulder, was the sudden and painful sensation of heat. They woke up in their respective quarters, all 6 of them. He still didn't fully understand the mechanics. He tried asking the others how they made it back, but they weren't in a state to answer questions. Bea was catatonic, screaming and clutching her head in the hospital as if she still remembered the way that thing crushed a skull like a grapefruit. The soldier who fell against the wall was left paraplegic, though medical tests couldn't identify a single reason why, they said. The other soldier, the one who'd been dragged into the shelves, was comatose. He didn't know if he recovered, but he was alive. And Grant was left in a permanent psychotic state, compelled to write on any surface he could over and over again, sin after sin, desperately trying to rewrite the very book that had driven him to madness in the first place. Michael tried very hard to kill him. He had clear memories of being left to die in the dark. He was relieved they caught Michael before he managed to wring the life out of him with his bare hands. He never found out what happened to Michael after several men pried his hands from around his throat. Despite everything, he hoped Michael managed some kind of recovery. The door disappeared, thankfully, with no one on the other side. He knew they were planning future expeditions. It was for the best that such a thing couldn't happen again. They had no idea what was waiting for them. In a way, he could have convinced himself that the expedition never happened. Some days, even now, that's what he sincerely hoped could happen. There was no physical evidence. They appeared in their beds completely unscathed, except for a note stuck to his chest, and it was this final little touch that stood out to him, a stern confirmation of everything he had experienced. Returned to sender, 6 mortals, 5 were damaged in transit. Bodies were repaired to the best of my ability, but I was never good at that kind of thing. Minds are another matter entirely. Could not help myself in one case, leaving a fellow mortal to die in the dark. Didn't seem very sporting. Don't let anyone say I lack a sense of humor. Otherwise, no harm, no foul. Best wishes. His heart sank when he heard them read it to him. It confirmed his deepest worries. No one had been very honest with him since he arrived at the hospital. They had kept him bandaged up, so it wasn't easy to tell. But after hearing that note, he finally found the courage to reach up and remove the thick swath of fabric. Then, with shaking fingers, he finally touched his eyes, or rather, the empty sockets where they used to be. And that's a wrap. Did you enjoy the story? Drop a comment and let us know what you think. Thanks for sticking with us till the end. See you in the next video.